Hello fellow time travelers. Tonight we journey to a frigid January afternoon in the year 1919, to a bustling but unsuspecting neighborhood in Boston's North End. You stand among cobblestone streets, the air crisp against your cheeks, your boots crunching over ice-slicked paths. Horse hooves clatter nearby, steam rising from their snouts, and chimneys puff out threads of white smoke into a gray sky. The scent in the air is sweet, almost suspiciously sweet. And that sound you hear? Like a deep, metallic groan echoing off brick walls? Yeah, it's not your imagination. Something massive, dark, and disturbingly sticky is about to change the course of Boston's history forever. You probably never heard of this piece of lost history. We're talking about an event so bizarre, so unbelievable, that if it were in a movie, you'd roll your eyes and say, "Come on, no one would buy that." But it happened. And it's remembered as the day a tidal wave of molasses, yes, molasses, flattened an entire city block, killed 21 people, injured over 150 more, and made Boston smell like breakfast for weeks. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to be awesome and like the video, definitely subscribe, and absolutely ring that bell so you'll always know when we are off to a new time-traveling adventure together. In return, I promise to stand out by offering you the most interesting and valuable content guaranteed to help you drift off to a peaceful sound sleep. Now, post your location and local time in the comments so we know where and when you're watching from. Feel free to leave constructive feedback and requests as well. Now, turn off the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's time-traveling adventure together. You're stepping into Boston, January 15th, 1919. It's around lunchtime, and the city hums with everyday life. Kids run through the streets, escaping school for a quick breath of winter air. Workers from the docks warm their hands over open fires, and bakery windows fog up from the heat of rising dough inside. Just over your shoulder looms an enormous, unsightly structure, 50 feet tall and 90 feet wide, a steel tank that holds over 2 million gallons of dark, thick molasses. It sits like an industrial behemoth in the middle of the North End, the neighborhood around it cramped and tightly knit. Italian immigrants fill these streets with life, laughter, and labor. Just beyond the tank is the elevated train, its iron skeleton rattling as trolleys trundle past. The Purity Distilling Company owns the tank, though some locals joke that it owns the neighborhood too. Its sticky contents are meant for industrial alcohol, later transformed into explosives. War ended just 2 months ago, but demand still lingers. As you walk along Commercial Street, the tank dominates your view, ugly and rusty, its rivets visible like a child's Lego tower, built more for size than safety. It oozes molasses daily, and not metaphorically. Children sneak up with tin cups to scoop up the dark syrup that leaks from its seams. It hums, vibrates even, but no one seems to mind anymore. That should probably raise a red flag, right? You know, when your neighborhood has background noise from an enormous steel container full of potential doom. The tank was installed in 1915, just 4 years earlier, but already it has a reputation. The company filled it hastily, sometimes overnight, and legend has it that after the first time it leaked, a worker was ordered to paint it brown so no one would see the syrupy tears. Not a joke, just visual deception at its stickiest. You stand at the corner of Copp's Hill Terrace, looking down at the tank. Cold air whips around you, and suddenly, there's a strange tremble under your boots. A deep rumble, like a subway train approaching, but there's no schedule for one right now. And then, a sound like the world groaning in slow motion. Screams? No, it's steel shrieking. Your heart skips. And in that instant, everything slows. A dull boom erupts, not like a firework, not like thunder, but like something snapping apart from the inside. People turn their heads. Birds scatter. And then, chaos. You see it before you hear it fully, a brown wall rising from the ground like a monster. It's not liquid like water. It's thicker, heavier. It doesn't shimmer, it absorbs light. 25 feet tall, this wave of molasses moves faster than molasses is ever supposed to move, 35 miles per hour, faster than you can run. Oddball fact break. Molasses, under high pressure and cold temperatures, becomes surprisingly fluid. Engineers would later compare its initial burst to the behavior of lava or quicksand, but sweeter. Also deadlier. You spin to run. People scream. The air is suddenly filled with a sickening, treacly sweetness. Doors burst open, horses bolt, wagons tip, and windows shatter not from impact, but from the sheer pressure of air displaced by the blob. There's no time to think. Only time to survive. The tank itself? Gone. Shrapnel arcs into the sky, as pieces of the structure fly like angry frisbees. Nearby buildings crumple. The force is unlike anything you expected. It's like an explosion without fire, a syrupy shockwave. A firehouse is swept off its foundation. A freight car is hurled into a wall like it's made of paper. You leap sideways behind a post, narrowly dodging a piece of flying debris. Your boots suction into the rising tide of molasses, and it's like trying to run through wet cement. You hear a man yell for his dog. A woman calls for her children, voice choked by syrup and panic. The elevated train groans overhead, its supports bending dangerously as the wave crashes into them, but somehow, miraculously, they hold. Then silence. Well, not true silence. But the roar is over. Now it's a horrible, sticky quiet. Like the world has been dipped in glue. You stare down at your coat, glazed in molasses. The street is unrecognizable. It looks like a giant spilled an entire barrel of maple syrup over a diorama of a city. 100 questions rush through your mind. What happened? Is this real? How many people are gone? But all you can do now is wade through the syrup, each step slower than the last, into a disaster that will haunt the city, and you, for the rest of your life. You slog through the ankle-deep molasses, the freezing air biting your face while your legs feel like they're stuck in warm taffy. It's surreal. Just minutes ago, this was a normal day in Boston's North End. Now, the streets are unrecognizable, flattened under an oozing tidal wave of sugar. And towering over the carnage, or rather, what remains of it, is the twisted corpse of the steel tank that unleashed this chaos. The tank was supposed to be sturdy, industrial, and safe. But as you approach what's left of it, you can tell, this thing never stood a chance. Shards of jagged metal are scattered like giant blades, bent and curled as if the whole structure had imploded from shame. One panel, several tons of steel, was blown across Commercial Street and punched a hole straight through the foundation of a brick building. You step carefully, your boots sticking with every move, and circle the area where the tank once stood. The foundation is a crater now, filled with sludge and broken support beams. And here's the thing, this tank wasn't some accidental bystander in a freak event. No, it was the main character in a story that had been warning people for years, but no one wanted to listen. Back in 1915, the Purity Distilling Company had an idea. They needed to store vast quantities of molasses near Boston Harbor to feed the booming alcohol business, particularly to make industrial alcohol for munitions. There were no fancy government safety boards back then, no routine inspections with red tape. It was basically, hey, does it look like it'll hold molasses? Cool, slap it up. So they built this behemoth in just a matter of months, quick and cheap. The company's parent corporation, United States Industrial Alcohol, wanted results fast, and fast they got. What they didn't get? Structural integrity. Historians agree the design was flawed from the beginning. The steel used was too thin, just half the thickness required by later safety standards. There were no proper calculations for pressure. And perhaps the most alarming detail? The tank was never pressure tested before it was filled. That's like buying a trampoline, skipping the instructions, and immediately inviting 50 people to bounce on it. You glance up toward the skyline. Boston's skyline isn't very tall yet, but from this angle, you can see how tightly packed the north end is. Buildings are stacked like dominoes, close enough that once the Molasses started moving, there was nowhere for it to go but through. Standing at the perimeter of the wreckage, you can't help but overhear neighbors talking through the shock. "We told them it leaked," one man mutters, his hands trembling as he points at the crater. "Every day, it leaked." Another woman nods grimly. "We thought it was normal. We thought maybe molasses just sweats in winter." A fair question, why did no one stop it? Well, for one, it was a different era. Regulations were more like polite suggestions. Companies rarely faced consequences unless something truly catastrophic happened, and even then, maybe not. Second, the tank had been leaking since day one. Locals grew used to the sight of black streaks running down the side, as familiar as the cracks in the sidewalk or the way pigeons refused to leave the bakery roof. By the way, kids used to bring mugs or jars to the tank to collect drippings. They called it free syrup. One boy allegedly made a mini business out of it, charging a penny per ladle. Capitalism at its stickiest. The tank's location didn't help, either. Plopped smack in the middle of a working-class neighborhood, it loomed over tenements, bakeries, and horse stables. If the company had built it in a less crowded area, the damage might have been less severe. But then, they'd have to pay for more piping. And piping isn't cheap. You shift closer to where the tank's upper sections now rest in a twisted heap. Metal rivets lie scattered across the ground, each one about the size of a golf ball, though significantly deadlier if launched at high speeds. Engineers would later report that many of these rivets simply popped out under pressure, like corks from champagne bottles. Except, the champagne didn't kill anyone. A light snow begins to fall. It settles on top of the molasses, forming a strange brown slush that looks like dessert gone wrong. People have started using shovels to dig out the remains of carts, barrels, and even animals. One horse lies still, frozen mid-stride, eyes wide. You look away. There's shouting from the edge of the disaster zone. More residents are arriving, some looking for loved ones, others simply unable to believe what they are seeing. A man climbs atop a mound of debris and waves his arms at the few officials who've started to cordon off the area. "You see now," he shouts. I told him it was gonna blow one day." Historians aren't sure if any formal complaints were filed by the community before the explosion. There are scattered records. Some say a local police officer voiced concerns, others mention engineers hired to examine the leaks who were quickly dismissed by the company. Either way, the outcome is the same: ignored warnings, overlooked risks, and now a landscape that looks like a gingerbread village hit by a syrup tsunami. You step through a smashed wooden fence and pause near one of the tank's massive support beams. The beam has been sheared clean off, its edges ragged, like it was torn by hand. This wasn't just a structural failure, it was a total mechanical breakdown. Like the tank simply gave up. Oddly enough, the tank had been filled just a few days earlier, right after the weather briefly warmed. Fresh molasses, newly delivered by ship, was pumped in while the older contents sat near freezing. The heat caused the old molasses to ferment. Fermentation builds pressure. Pressure plus faulty design? You get a 2 million-gallon sugar bomb. You lean back against a lamppost and try to picture the tank as it was, towering, humming, slow leaks camouflaged by brown paint. Everyone passed it daily. Some called it a landmark. Some called it an eyesore. But no one, not even the engineers of the day, called it safe. And now? It's just twisted wreckage. A cautionary tale. An industrial blunder painted in shades of brown. The snow thickens slightly. You watch as it collects in rivets of molasses, melting into the surface, then disappearing altogether, like the city is trying, awkwardly, to wash itself clean. The silence, sticky and strange, settles heavier than the molasses itself. You take another slow step forward, your foot squelching free with a soft schloop that makes you grimace. The neighborhood feels like it's been wrapped in a caramel straitjacket. The remaining buildings are coated head to toe in syrup. Doorways sealed. First-floor windows resemble gingerbread houses gone grotesquely wrong. Then, the cries begin. Not loud. Not panicked. But desperate. Muffled voices from inside collapsed structures. Whimpers behind thick syrup walls. The living are still in there, trapped under debris, under syrup, under what used to be an ordinary Tuesday. You head toward a collapsed building on the corner, what's left of Engine 31, once home to 10 proud firefighters. Now it looks like a child's toy crushed underfoot. Part of the structure has folded inward, and faint tapping rises from beneath the rubble. Someone's alive. Rescue teams arrive, breathless, slipping through the muck with axes and ropes. The molasses has cooled fast, congealing into a gelatinous barrier. It clings to shovels, stiffens around boots, refuses to let go. Even the air feels heavy, sweet and sickening in your lungs. You watch one of the first rescuers, a mustached officer with soaked boots, tie a rope around his chest and crawl into the wreckage. Two others brace him as he inches forward, brick by brick, toward the tapping. They drag a firefighter out 20 minutes later, face sticky, eyes wide, coughing dark syrup. He's alive. Barely. It wasn't just hard to get through, it was everywhere. It smothered everything. Streets, sidewalks, alleys. It seeped into basements. Flooded stables. Punched through buildings like a slow-motion battering ram. And when something isn't deadly enough on its own, it brings company. Here come the rats. Welcome to the forgotten horror of the Great Molasses Flood. When Boston's rat population suddenly found itself in paradise. Thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, drawn out of sewers by the overpowering scent of sugar. According to early reports, officers had to shoot rats during the cleanup. They had no intention of leaving. Some had eaten so much molasses they could barely move. You leave the firehouse ruins, heading deeper into the destruction zone. It's a slog. For every step forward, you slip half a step back. People move in slow motion, some dragging boards, others hauling wagons or simply wandering dazed. A rescue dog, chest deep in molasses, yelps in frustration, its paws suctioned in place. A volunteer scoops it up and trudges back toward drier ground. And yet, among the horror, flickers of tenderness. A man gently wipes molasses from a child's face. A priest kneels in the street, praying over a body just pulled from the mess. A human chain forms, neighbors passing buckets of water, though it hardly helps. Molasses doesn't wash away. It clings. Like guilt. Historians agree, the response that day was chaotic, brave, almost miraculous. Police, firefighters, nurses, soldiers, they rushed in with planks, sleds, ropes, rafts. Anything to reach survivors before they drowned. And yes, people drowned. In syrup. One boy, Antonio Di Stagio, 10 years old, was swept away from his family. His body was found days later, 30 feet from where he'd last been seen, curled like he'd fallen asleep. His sister Maria survived, but never spoke about the flood again. You approach what's left of a delivery stable. The smell hits first. Not all the horses made it out. Those that did are trembling, eyes wide, crusted in brown from head to hoof. Their handlers coax and tug, but many refuse to move. Above it all, a new sound, creaking metal. The elevated railway. Somehow, the wave hadn't fully toppled the tracks. But one iron support is bent at a steep angle. A train had crossed just minutes before the tank burst. 30 seconds later, and it might have plunged into the syrup below. Historians still debate how it held. Dumb luck? Divine intervention? Good engineering? Night falls. Electric lamps flicker on, casting golden halos over the brown ruin. It could be beautiful, if not for the bodies. Over a dozen recovered so far. Some crushed. Some drowned. Some flung through windows by the blast. All of them glazed in molasses. You pause at a ruined bakery. Its front window shattered, interior flattened. On the counter, a half-eaten loaf of bread, untouched by syrup. A quiet reminder of how fast life flips from normal to nightmare. And the smell, oh, the smell. At first, pleasant. Nostalgic. Warm. But now it's turning. Sour. Acrid. Like sugar left out too long. Fermented dreams. You find a dryish wall and sit. Your clothes are ruined. Gloves stiff. Hat lost. Around you, survivors sit in silence, faces glazed in disbelief and syrup. Somewhere, a bell tolls. Not for the hour, but for the dead. Tomorrow, the tally begins. But tonight, people are still trapped. Bodies still missing. Syrup still holding on. You close your eyes and listen to the strange new soundscape of the North End, labored breathing, scraping shovels, creaking steel, and somewhere, impossibly, a piano playing in an upstairs room no one's reached yet. You open your eyes to darkness that's not quite night. It's lit here and there by the flicker of lanterns and the dull gleam of molasses reflecting gaslight, pools of syrup turned into twisted, sticky mirrors of the catastrophe. There's no hum of traffic, no chatter from storefronts. The North End has gone mute, like the city itself is holding its breath, too stunned to speak. The cold deepens. Boston in January never plays nice, and now that the wind has picked up, it's weaponized. It slices through wet clothes, makes soaked boots feel like ice blocks, and hardens the molasses into a nearly immovable glue. People are freezing as they search. Rescuers working by hand can barely keep warm, their breath pluming out like smoke signals over a battlefield. And yet the digging doesn't stop. A few men have fashioned makeshift stretchers from doors wrenched off their hinges. The Boston Police, Fire Department, and even off-duty soldiers from nearby Fort Devens have joined the effort. Some crawl across the hardened molasses on planks, trying not to sink in. Others are pounding at walls, calling out names. The scene would look heroic if it weren't also so haunting. You find yourself standing by a fire brigade wagon, now toppled on its side like a broken toy. Nearby, two nurses crouch over a man who's coughing syrup from his lungs. One of them wipes his face tenderly, using her own coat sleeve. The other whispers encouragement, even though it's not clear if he's conscious enough to hear. Here's something you probably didn't expect. This molasses wave wasn't silent. According to survivors, the sound it made as it rushed through the streets was like a freight train roaring through a tunnel, mixed with the low, vibrating growl of an earthquake. One witness claimed it sounded like the world cracking open. Another said it was more like the moan of a wounded animal, stretched over a city block. Historians still debate just how fast the wave actually traveled. Some reports say 25 miles per hour. Others argue it was closer to 35. Either way, for molasses, a substance famous for being slow, it moved with the fury and speed of a landslide. And it had weight behind it. Millions of pounds of warm syrup hurtling down narrow city streets. One moment you're walking home from work, the next you're picked up, spun around, and slammed into a brick wall by a dessert topping. Now, think about this: human bones break, skulls crack, lungs fill. And in molasses, you can't scream. Every breath becomes a struggle. You inhale sugar. You choke on it. One of the first fatalities was a man named Giuseppe Racca, a worker at a nearby foundry. He had just stepped outside for a smoke break when the wave hit. It hurled him against a lamppost, shattering his ribs. He died before anyone could reach him. His brother survived, only because he was running late that day. You trudge toward where a small crowd has gathered in eerie silence. They're staring at something half submerged in the syrup. You squint. It's a wagon, or what's left of one. The wheels are visible, spinning slightly in the breeze, but the horse that once pulled it is nowhere in sight. Someone whispers that they found a dog under it, still breathing. A little terrier. His eyes are glazed, but he's alive. Oddball trivia: after the cleanup began, a few surviving pets were treated as heroes of the neighborhood. One cat, reportedly named Sweetie, survived the flood by climbing into a flour sack and riding it like a lifeboat down the syrup tide. The owner claimed she never ate molasses again. The cat, not the owner. Further up the street, you see what's left of a delivery company, the Bay State Street Railway Freight Terminal. It had been storing several freight cars and goods. Now, the rail tracks have buckled, and the building has folded in on itself. Ironically, the molasses was intended for industries like this. Factories, munitions, fermentation. But instead of fueling a war effort, it flattened the businesses it was supposed to supply. There's movement under one of the beams. A teenage boy, maybe 16, is hacking at the molasses with a crowbar, trying to free his father, who's pinned by a chunk of fallen wall. He's shouting, cursing, sobbing, all at once. The syrup is too thick to see through. Rescue workers pull the boy back just in time. The beam collapses further. His father doesn't make it out. By now, you're starting to notice something peculiar. Molasses stains everything, but not evenly. Some walls are coated. Some are shattered clean. A nearby signpost, bent at the base, still has a handbill stuck to it, advertising a vaudeville act from last weekend. It's crusted in brown, but still legible. A man in a top hat, smiling too wide. Hilarious. Uproarious. Don't miss it, the ad says. The joke, tragically, has aged poorly. You pass a group of men with buckets, trying to clear a path. One of them mutters, "We'll be at this for weeks." He's wrong. It'll take months. Historians agree the cleanup effort was one of the most grueling public works operations in early 20th century Boston. Crews had to shovel hardened molasses into carts by hand. Then came the salt water, brought in by fireboats, sprayed over the streets in a desperate attempt to wash away the goo. Salt water helped a little, but it also turned the molasses into a thin, syrupy sludge that ran back into the harbor. And that's when the harbor turned brown. For weeks, fish died. Boats got stuck. Seagulls refused to land. You walk back toward the waterfront, passing workers huddled around fires. They look like ghosts, every one of them stained in various shades of amber. No one's talking anymore. The work continues, but it's slowed to a crawl. You reach the edge of the pier, looking out at the now tainted water. Beneath the surface, everything looks warped. You can't tell if that's a fish or a boot. The smell is stronger here: sugar, salt, rot. You breathe through your mouth. And just as you turn to leave, a scrap of cloth floats by, brown, soaked, unidentifiable. But someone behind you sees it and begins to sob. Another body, perhaps. Or a reminder of one. The harbor will give up its dead slowly. You walk away, molasses clinging to your steps like regret. The wind howls again, and the sound of it blends with the distant, steady clanging of a work bell. Cleanup has only just begun. And this mess, literal and legal, will linger far longer than anyone expects. Morning in the North End arrives like a slow exhale, grey, cold, and quiet except for the rhythmic clang of shovels and the slosh of syrup being scooped into barrels. You walk through the neighborhood with your coat stiff as cardboard and your boots making that familiar schloop sound every few steps. The molasses has cooled even further overnight, turning from ooze to jelly. Streets resemble overcooked brownies, cracked and treacherous. Nothing smells like breakfast. The sweet scent that once drifted through Boston's air has turned. Fermented sugar now carries a bite, like vinegar's meaner cousin. You sniff, then regret it. A group of city workers are pouring salt water from large containers. One gags. You pass a woman in her nightgown, standing in what used to be her parlor. Her feet are bare, crusted in molasses, and she's sipping tea from a chipped cup like it's the most normal thing in the world. Her eyes are far away. People aren't shocked anymore, they're numb. Cleanup crews have organized overnight. There are wagons, horses, buckets. A few workers even have long-handled brooms. One man is trying to sweep molasses like it's autumn leaves. It's not working, but the effort counts for something. This is where the legal flood begins. The company that owned the tank? United States Industrial Alcohol. Their big iron tank, 50 feet tall, 90 feet wide, was a familiar sight along Commercial Street. Until yesterday, it held over 2 million gallons of molasses. And here's the thing, the tank was known to groan and leak. Kids collected molasses drips in tin cups. Not leaks, cracks. One worker even painted it brown to disguise the seepage. Like nobody would notice syrup leaking from a brown tank. Historians disagree on whether the company ever tested it. But the tank was rushed into use during World War I, when molasses was used to make alcohol for explosives. Safety took a back seat. Now, with the tank gone and the neighborhood drowning, the company starts spinning a new story. You spot a fresh sign nailed to a wall, lawyers needed. Claims being filed. Boston's stickiest courtroom battle has begun. Families line up. Some lost homes. Some lost relatives. Some lost everything. The company blames anarchists. It's 1919, and blaming radicals is in vogue. But the people of the North End aren't buying it. Historians agree, this wasn't sabotage. Just a bad tank. Never pressure tested. Rushed to maximize profit. Nearby, a man takes photos for a Boston newspaper. The flash pops. A crowd blinks. Pictures of the disaster soon circulate nationwide. Most Americans can't believe it. Molasses? Really? Papers dub it the Boston Molasses Disaster. Some go with syrup tsunami or Boston's brownout. Questions follow. Why wasn't the tank inspected? Why were the leaks ignored? Why fill it in winter, when molasses expands and contracts with temperature swings? Here's a strange detail. The night before the tank burst, the temperature jumped from 2 to nearly 40 degrees. That spike caused the molasses to expand quickly, stressing an already weak structure. Boom! One engineer compared it to shaking a soda can in a microwave. Don't try that. Outside a molasses-flooded school, a teacher draws a diagram on a chalkboard. One kid asks, "Can we sue Molasses?" Honestly, fair question. Clean up inches forward. Crews scoop and scrub non-stop. Fireboats spray salt water. Horses haul carts full of syrup. One reporter jokes you can't swing a cat without hitting a sugar-covered shovel. A real cat, meanwhile, sits on a stoop, licking its molasses-stiff tail. It looks like it regrets everything. You hear bagpipes in the distance, played by a Scottish fireman mourning a lost friend. The sound floats between brownstones, eerie and calm. It chills you in a way the cold doesn't. People use whatever they can find: shovels, pans, baking sheets. One family uses a snow shovel. They've barely cleared their front step. This will take weeks. But it's not just about cleanup. This disaster has a psychological toll. The kind you don't mop up. People whisper about the tank. Some claim to hear it groan at night. Dogs avoid certain blocks. Stores hang signs that read syrup-free since February. At the site of the old Purity Distilling Company, now just twisted beams and bent pipe, a few men in suits scribble notes. Engineers. Insurance representatives. One mutters about load stress. Another just shakes his head. A lawyer walks past, muttering into a notebook. The lawsuits are underway. 71 plaintiffs. Dozens of lawyers. Endless testimony. It becomes the longest legal case in Massachusetts history. But here's the twist: the victims win. It takes years. Hundreds of interviews. Expert witnesses. A chemist named Arthur D. Little conducts molasses flow tests to show how fast the syrup moved. He proves the tank was poorly designed and the company's defense was syrup thin. In the end, United States Industrial Alcohol is ordered to pay damages, about $600,000, nearly $10 million today. Justice, slow and sticky, arrives. You stand at the corner where it began. The tank is gone. The space it occupied is just wind now. No sign. No monument. Just echoes of groaning steel. You close your eyes and picture it: the first crack, the rush, the chaos. Boston turned brown in an instant. And tomorrow? The city will try to move on. But the memory sticks. You walk down Prince Street just as the afternoon sun starts to melt into a soft amber glow, casting long, syrup-colored shadows across the stone. A woman leans out of her second-story window, scrubbing molasses off the shutters with a sponge that used to be white. She doesn't look down. Just keeps scrubbing, over and over again. Like if she stops, the sweet stink might find a way back in. The air still carries it. The sour, overcooked scent of molasses that clings to everything: coats, bricks, mailboxes, and even memories. You pass a man pulling a handcart full of old mattresses soaked through with syrup, each one weighing as much as a small elephant. "Goodbye, comfort," he mutters. You glance down Commercial Street. That's where the tank used to stand, a looming beast of steel and rivets, now reduced to a warped mess of rust and regret. It's hard to believe that a few days ago, this block was bustling with deliveries and workers. Horses trotted past with clattering hooves. Kids shouted at each other in a tangle of Italian and English. Everything smelled like bread and coal smoke. Normal. Now? Now it smells like a gingerbread house after a hurricane. And if you think this is just about molasses, you're only seeing the sticky surface. Because underneath the mess, Boston is transforming. The disaster has jolted the city awake. You can feel it in the tension between neighbors. In the sudden flurry of reporters, investigators, and politicians descending like seagulls on a boardwalk fry. For the first time, the working-class families of the North End aren't just enduring tragedy, they're demanding answers. It's the beginning of something bigger. Historians agree, the Great Molasses Flood wasn't just a bizarre accident. It was a catalyst for change. One that forced America to rethink how industrial companies operate. You pause by a broken lamppost where two men are arguing. One is older, gray-haired, with molasses caked into the creases of his coat. The other is younger, with a clipboard and a tie too bright for someone who's never scraped syrup from his eyebrows. They're debating whether the foundation of a nearby tenement was weakened in the flood. The older man insists it's sinking. The younger one replies, "According to our report, and you already know he's lost." This is the start of Boston's long, slow journey toward accountability. Regulations, safety inspections, building codes. And if those sound boring, think about it this way. If someone had enforced those rules before 1919, maybe 21 people wouldn't be buried under 6 million gallons of sweet, brown neglect. You follow the sound of hammering. A crew is trying to reinforce a brick wall that nearly collapsed during the wave. The foreman tells his men to check for syrup in the mortar. Yeah, you heard that right. Molasses in the mortar. That's how deeply it seeped into the infrastructure. Some bricks had to be thrown out completely. Others are being cleaned with hot vinegar water. Which, by the way, smells like the worst salad dressing ever created. And here's an oddball fact. The cleanup effort became so intense that molasses was tracked miles outside the North End by cleanup crews' boots. Reports came in from Quincy, 10 miles away, of sticky footprints on train platforms. Even boats in the harbor found molasses on their decks. Boston Harbor itself turned a weird brown for weeks, attracting seagulls in disturbingly large flocks. You don't even want to know what that did to the fish. As you walk past Paul Revere's old house, still standing, somehow, like a smug time traveler, you wonder what he would have thought about all this. Probably would have galloped around shouting, "The syrup is coming," instead. But jokes aside, there's an eerie beauty in how people endure. A bakery owner sets up a makeshift stall outside her destroyed shop. She's handing out loaves for free, wrapped in wax paper. "Can't sell what smells like sugar glue," she says, then adds, "Eat up, dear, it's still bread." You take one. It's warm, comforting, and just a little chewy in a way bread shouldn't be. Down the block, a group of neighborhood boys are daring each other to slide across a molasses-coated patch of sidewalk. One of them wipes out spectacularly, landing in a gooey sprawl that would make an octopus jealous. The others roar with laughter. For them, it's not tragedy, it's adventure. That's the weird thing about being young in a disaster zone. Everything feels like a game until it doesn't. You look up. A window opens and a radio crackles to life, some distant station reporting on the ongoing lawsuits. It's hard to hear over the breeze and the squish-squish of passing boots, but you catch a phrase, company negligence. And then, compensation for victims. You remember one of the engineers from earlier, pacing around the wreckage of the tank. He said something about tensile failure and steel fatigue. What he meant was, this thing was built wrong, and we all knew it. Historians still debate whether the tank was ever pressure tested at all. Some say no. Others say maybe, but poorly. One theory even suggests the steel used in the tank was too brittle for cold temperatures, more prone to cracking like a frozen pond under a heavy boot. Regardless of the specifics, one thing is clear, this didn't have to happen. You stand outside a church, its front steps stained a sickly brown. The priest is talking to a small group of mourners, Funerals are being held almost daily now. He speaks softly, and though you can't make out the words, the grief in his posture is unmistakable. You don't know it yet, but over the next few months, the courts will see testimony from hundreds of witnesses. Experts will simulate molasses flows using sand and syrup to show just how fast it could move. Children will be asked to recall the wave. So will firefighters, shopkeepers, bakers, butchers. Some will cry. Some will stay stone-faced. Some will simply shrug and say, "We heard a bang, and then everything went brown." And in a way, that's the truest summary of all. You stop near a barber's shop where someone has etched "We survived the flood" into the window. Inside, the floor is still sticky. The chairs have been set back upright. A customer sits with a half-finished haircut. "Can't look worse than the tank," he jokes, and the barber chuckles dryly. But the molasses isn't done with Boston just yet. The next morning, you slip out into a city that's starting to itch beneath its sticky skin. It's as if Boston can't decide whether to mourn, rebuild, or lash out. You turn a corner and find a crowd gathered, tight as puzzle pieces, outside a temporary hearing tent. That's right, a canvas courtroom, hastily set up just a few blocks from the flood zone. Because when your disaster involves molasses, everything, even justice, moves at half speed and smells like pancakes. You squeeze closer. A man in a rumpled brown suit stands before a judge who looks like he hasn't had a full night's sleep since the tank burst. The man is a lawyer for the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, USIA for short, the owners of the molasses tank. And he is sweating bullets. His voice is thin and practiced, declaring the tank was adequately constructed and regularly inspected. There's a faint groan from the back of the crowd. You look over and spot the retired fire chief shaking his head slowly, like a metronome of disbelief. And that, right there, is what the next several years of hearings are going to be about. Yeah, you heard that right. Years. Historians agree this became one of the longest civil suits in Massachusetts history. More than 100 lawsuits were filed against USIA by victims and their families. And that canvas tent? Just the opening act. A few feet away, a reporter scribbles in his notepad. The Boston Globe is running daily updates. Everyone wants to know, was the tank a ticking time bomb from day one? You recall how earlier rumors swirled, how the tank would groan and rumble, how kids used to collect the molasses that leaked from its seams, as casually as picking wild berries. No one thought it would explode. At least, not like that. A man in a bowler hat nudges you. "You see that?" he whispers, pointing to a box labeled Exhibit B. It contains a twisted section of the tank wall, all jagged steel teeth and rivets popped like bubble wrap. "That's what burst first," he adds. "Weak spot in the weld." Historians still debate whether that weld ever stood a chance. You drift over to a table stacked with papers, engineers' reports, inspection logs, and a rather famous document scrawled by a whistleblower who once warned that the tank shook like jelly when full. USIA ignored him. Or maybe they didn't. Maybe they just didn't care. It was wartime, after all. Molasses meant alcohol. Alcohol meant munitions. Who had time for a nervous tank? Turns out, molasses wasn't just sweet syrup, it was war fuel. That same sticky goo could be distilled into industrial alcohol, a key ingredient in explosives. In fact, many historians believe the tank was hurriedly built in 1915 during World War I to meet demand. The urgency? The need for speed? It may explain why safety checks were skipped, welds were sloppy, and the steel was thin, literally thinner than industry standards of the time. So when the war ended and alcohol sales plummeted, Yuja had a huge tank full of highly pressurized molasses and not much urgency to unload it. And cold January air doesn't play nice with warm syrup. Pressure builds. Steel contracts. Rivets strain. Boom. Back at the hearing, you overhear a quiet debate among spectators. "Why haven't they arrested anyone?" one woman asks. Another replies, "Because money doesn't get arrested. It just buys better lawyers." That remark hangs in the air like a sour perfume. You step outside. Across the street, someone has painted "Sweet Justice" in dripping brown letters on a brick wall. It's not clear if it's sarcasm or hope. Maybe both. You head north toward the waterfront where a temporary memorial has popped up. Photos of the dead, wilting flowers, burnt candles melted into puddles of wax. One photo catches your eye, a fireman, boots submerged, staring down the ruins of Engine 31. His station had been crushed instantly when the molasses wave smashed through the wall. And here's a zany detail you might not expect. Some people insisted the tank was sabotaged by anarchists. Yup. Sabotage theories cropped up almost immediately, mostly fueled by post-war paranoia and anti-immigrant sentiment. Remember, this was only 2 years after the Russian Revolution and just months before the infamous Red Scare gripped America. Italians, in particular, many of whom lived in the North End and worked nearby, were unfairly targeted as suspects. "It must have been radicals," some muttered. "Bombers. Unionists. Immigrants. Anything but industrial negligence." But no bombs were ever found. No credible threats. No manifestos. Just an overfilled tank and bad engineering. You press on and arrive at a schoolhouse being cleaned out. One of the janitors lets you peek inside. "Took 4 days just to open the basement door," he mutters. "Molasses poured in like it was hunting us." He chuckles nervously. "We teach math here. Not swimming." Some rooms had to be abandoned altogether. Floors warped. Books ruined. One school reportedly smelled like burnt sugar for months. Another was closed temporarily after students kept getting headaches. Apparently, molasses and childhood don't mix as well as cartoons might suggest. And yet, amid all this absurdity, something crucial is happening behind the scenes. Engineers begin testing building materials. City officials talk about zoning laws. Safety becomes more than just a checkbox, it starts to matter. Boston is learning from the syrupy slap it just received. You pause on a hill overlooking the harbor. Ships drift lazily across the water, their hulls clean now, though some captains still complain of sugar drag. The city is rebuilding, but it will never forget. The tank, the wave, the cleanup, it all sticks. Literally and metaphorically. Back in the North End, a boy with molasses-slicked boots runs past you, laughing, chased by a dog that's somehow even stickier than he is. Life, in all its strange resilience, keeps bouncing forward. But justice is slower. Slower than syrup in January. Because the hearings aren't over. The lawsuits aren't settled. And Yuja? They're preparing to argue that the disaster was an act of God. Sure. Just blame the Almighty for faulty rivets. You wake to the muffled clatter of courtroom chairs being dragged into place again. Another day, another deposition. The makeshift tent that once held the early hearings has now given way to full-scale courtrooms across the city. You slip into the back row of one such room, dodging the rustle of legal papers and the occasional groan from a weary stenographer. The civil suits have consolidated into one massive investigation known as a master case, and the room has all the tension of a high-stakes poker game. If the chips were legal liability and the stakes were decades of industrial accountability. You scan the front bench. There's Arthur Gell, the engineer who signed off on the tank's design, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. His resume, you've heard, includes little formal training in structural engineering. That might be relevant when you're responsible for a tank holding over 2 million gallons of molasses. That's millions with an M. Today's testimony begins with Charles Evans, a metallurgist brought in as an expert witness. He holds up a warped section of steel, thin as a tin lunchbox lid, and taps it with his knuckle. The sound it makes? Pathetic. This steel, he explains gently, contains too little manganese, making it brittle, especially in cold weather. You glance around the room. Jurors scribble notes. Reporters arch their brows. Even the judge leans forward a bit. Historians agree, this testimony marks a turning point. Because until now, the defense had leaned on vague ideas of sabotage and natural disasters. But Evans' analysis offers something new, proof. This wasn't a random accident. The tank was flawed by design. You lean back in your chair, a little stunned. How many disasters start not with fire or flood, but with paperwork, shortcuts, and someone saying, close enough? And here's your oddball trivia for tonight. Before the tank was filled with molasses, USIA never performed a stress test. Not one. No test fills. No trial runs. They just dumped in the sticky stuff and crossed their caramel-coated fingers. Outside the courtroom, you catch snippets of conversation. Did you hear they only painted the tank brown to hide the leaks? Someone mutters. That's true, by the way. USIA tried to camouflage their problems, literally, with paint. In the same way you might Sharpie over a coffee stain on a white shirt and pretend it never happened. Genius. You make your way over to a cluttered desk where a woman named Bridget O'Reilly is waiting to testify. Her husband was one of the workers who died near the tank. She's holding a worn photograph, edges curled like toast left too long under the broiler. She doesn't speak when she hands it to the court clerk. She just nods once, like a thread being cut. You feel that in your chest. Behind her, another family prepares to tell their story. And another. And another. Over time, over months, the court listens. Victim after victim, day after day. Some break down in tears. Others are angry. A few just want answers. But all of them want someone, anyone, held accountable. Meanwhile, USIA's lawyers file delay after delay. It's a tactic as old as law itself. Outwait the outrage. Stretch it until people forget, until the syrup crust hardens and the smell fades and the public moves on. But Boston isn't moving on. Not yet. You walk through the North End after court and something feels different. Clean, yes, but wary. Like the neighborhood knows it's being watched. Insurance agents come and go like moths around a street lamp. Journalists hang around stoops, waiting for quotes. Even neighborhood kids are whispering theories like they're building their own courtroom dramas in the alleyways. At a bakery near Hanover Street, you eavesdrop on two men talking over coffee and hard rolls. One shakes his head and mutters, "You know, they say the tank was never even safe for horses to be near." You believe that? The other shrugs. Not after what I've seen. You cross paths with a city council member, sleeves rolled, necktie askew. "We're not just rebuilding streets," he says. "We're rewriting the book on industrial regulation." And he's not kidding. One unexpected side effect of the molasses flood? It forces Boston, and eventually other cities, to rethink how they approve, inspect, and regulate large industrial structures. Engineers begin advocating for stricter building codes. Cities begin requiring permits and regular inspections. In a very molassesy way, progress begins to stick. Historians still wonder what might have happened if the flood hadn't occurred. Would those same reforms have taken decades longer? Or not at all? By now, the case has racked up tens of thousands of pages of testimony. There are photos, blueprints, financial ledgers, accident reports, and about 100 variations on the phrase, "We had no idea this would happen." But intent only goes so far when negligence is dripping from every rivet. And finally, the judgment comes down. User is found liable. The company must pay over $600,000 in damages, a massive sum for the time. Some families receive several $1,000s each. Others, less. But the message is clear: you can't cut corners and expect to walk away clean. There's a moment of subdued victory in the courtroom. A slow exhale. But outside, Boston's not throwing a party. There's no confetti. Just cautious nods, a few tearful smiles, and one man lighting a cigar in quiet tribute to his lost brother. You head back toward the harbor and pause near the old tank site. It's been cleared now, no twisted steel, no foul sweet sludge. Just a fenced-off patch of dirt that looks oddly innocent. You press your palm against the cool railing and let your eyes close. You can still imagine it: molasses rising, air splitting, bricks tumbling like dice. But now, you also see something else. Justice, slow and sticky, but eventually poured. And in the background, a dockworker calls to his crew, "Watch that line, it's slicker than molasses in January." Everyone laughs. Too soon? Maybe. But that's how cities heal. Your shoes crunch softly over gravel as you return to the north end, where a faint trace of molasses still lingers in the air, like the ghost of a bakery past. But today, there's no court, no cleanup, no engineers gesturing at twisted rivets. Today, Boston begins the business of remembering. You head toward Copp's Hill, one of the oldest cemeteries in the city. The trees lean gently in the wind, and the tombstones are hunched and crooked, like they've heard too many stories and can't quite sit upright anymore. There's no official monument yet, but someone has propped up a wooden sign in the soil, hand-painted in brown letters, "Here we remember the lost of the molasses flood." It's not fancy, but it sticks with you. As you stroll down Commercial Street, the chatter shifts. Not legal talk, not mourning. Now people are telling asterisk story star. One man recalls how his father helped carry a survivor out on a door used as a stretcher. A woman at a corner store says she remembers when the molasses got into the pipes. Every time you turned on the tap, the water ran brown. Historians agree, this is the stage when tragedy becomes legend. Just like Paul Revere's Ride or the Great Fire of London, the molasses flood begins to morph. It becomes bigger than facts, taller than buildings. It's something you can use in everyday speech. He was moving slower than molasses in January, and actually mean it. Because now, it's not just an idiom. It's your city's strange, sticky truth. You reach a neighborhood bar where a few old-timers lean back in their chairs, nursing drinks and talking like they were there, even though most of them clearly weren't. "I heard the wave was 15 feet high," says one. 20, insists another. "Carried a horse clean over a fence." Someone chuckles. Next you'll say it was swimming. Still, the details aren't always exaggerated. Some survivors really did describe the wave as rising as high as the second story. And yes, horses were swept away. A few were found days later, stuck to the sides of buildings, like macabre decals in a nightmare snow globe. But maybe the strangest legacy of all is how molasses found its way into Boston's culture, permanently. Local newspapers revisit the flood every January. Schools write essays about it. And the phrase molasses disaster becomes shorthand for bureaucratic failure and corporate negligence. It's one of those rare phrases that's both goofy and grim, like exploding custard or banana peel lawsuit. Even the weather played a role in preserving the legend. That cold snap after the flood helped harden the molasses, freezing it to walls and lampposts like amber trapping insects. And later, the sun baked it into cracks so deep that decades would pass before it stopped reappearing with every heat wave. Want a fun tidbit? 4 years afterward, Bostonians swore they could still smell molasses on warm summer days. Even now, a few old locals insist the scent still wafts up near the old tank site when the wind is just right. It's either nostalgia or olfactory PTSD. Historians still debate whether the molasses flood was truly a turning point in American industrial oversight or merely a grotesque anomaly. Did it really lead to lasting reform? Or did the next generation forget all over again, until the next disaster shook everyone awake? You stroll along the wharf where the harbor looks tranquil now, glinting with late afternoon gold. But you remember reading that molasses didn't just flood the streets, it spilled into the sea. Some of it floated for days in slick brown patches that stank like spoiled sugar. And ships couldn't dock properly because the water was too thick. Imagine that, an entire harbor slowed by syrup. As you reach the former site of the tank, a man walks his dog past you. He nods toward a plaque that's finally been installed. It's small, modest. You read the inscription slowly. Asterisk: on this site on January 15, 1919, a molasses tank burst, causing a wave that killed 21 people and injured over 100. The disaster changed building codes and safety regulations across the country. Asterisk: no drama, no hyperbole, just a simple truth set in bronze. The man sighs and says, "My grandfather was a firefighter. Said it was the worst day he ever had." His dog sniffs at the base of the plaque, uninterested in history. You give them a quiet nod. Further down, a tour guide in suspenders is giving a walking lecture to a group of visitors, gesturing at invisible syrup waves with grand flair. "It came out so fast," he says, "that some people were thrown across the street without ever seeing what hit them." A woman gasps. A boy in a Red Sox cap mutters, "Whoa." You smile. Because yes, it was horrible. But also yes, it's now a story passed down with awe, caution, and the occasional wisecrack. You cross into a bookstore near Haymarket Square and spot a children's book titled The Great Boston Molasses Flood Star. The cover shows a cartoon wave chasing people down the street like a monster made of maple syrup. It's not accurate, but it's not wrong either. You flip through it. The drawings are colorful. There's even a fun facts page in the back. Did you know the molasses wave was moving faster than a speeding trolley car? You chuckle. Then you pause. Because that's also true. And that's how history sticks around. Through stories. Through jokes. Through sweet, slow remembrance. You take one more walk through the neighborhood, past laundromats and cafes and souvenir shops that sell molasses cookies shaped like tank cars. Someone's even built a replica of the tank in miniature, complete with rivets that look just a little too loose. It's displayed on a pedestal next to a plaque that reads, "May we always build better." And yeah, maybe we will. Because Boston didn't just clean up the flood. It changed because of it. And it remembers. Always, it remembers. You slip into a quieter part of Boston now, where the city's endless hum softens into the occasional bark of a dog and the distant whistle of a streetcar. It's a place where people talk less about the disaster and more about its aftermath, the ripples it sent through industry, science, and city planning that spread far beyond the sticky streets of the North End. You're walking past a cluster of brick buildings when you notice a plaque on one of them. It commemorates the birth of stricter building codes in Massachusetts, passed just months after the flood. For a city that prided itself on resilience, this was the start of a serious wake-up call. You imagine the debates that must have raged, lawmakers arguing whether to impose costly regulations on powerful industries or to let them continue unchecked, fueled by greed and a stubborn faith in good enough. Historians still debate how much of the new regulation was truly inspired by the Molasses flood and how much was part of a larger national trend in safety reform. But in Boston, there's no question. The flood is woven into the city's legislative DNA. You find yourself at a university library, browsing through old engineering journals from the early 1920s. Here, scientists and engineers write about lessons learned from the disaster, carefully analyzing the tank's failure. They describe the dangers of using subpar steel, the risks of skipping inspections, and the critical importance of testing tanks under realistic conditions. You almost feel the earnestness in their words, as if they're trying to make sure no one ever repeats the mistakes of the past. The engineers' focus on safety and accountability gave rise to modern industrial standards, standards that protect millions of people today from hidden dangers they never even think about. It's a reminder that sometimes, progress comes from tragedy. You pause, flipping a page, and a quirky detail catches your eye. The first official Molasses safety manual was published in Boston in 1921. It's a surprisingly thick book filled with charts, formulas, and diagrams detailing how to build tanks that wouldn't burst like overfilled soda cans. You smile at the image of earnest engineers poring over these pages, determined to keep Molasses and the world contained. Back on the streets, you watch city workers installing new water pipes and sewer lines, improvements prompted by the flood's damage. The infrastructure they are building isn't just practical, it's symbolic. It's a physical manifestation of a city refusing to be undone by its past. At a small cafe nearby, you overhear a conversation between two architects. One jokes, "You know, if you can build a molasses tank that doesn't explode, you can build anything." They laugh, but there's truth there. The disaster was a challenge that forced builders to rethink their craft and pushed Boston to the forefront of industrial safety. It's strange to think that a flood of sticky syrup could influence architecture and engineering so profoundly. But that's history for you, unexpected, messy, and sometimes a little sweet. Later, you visit a museum exhibit dedicated to the Great Molasses Flood. It's modest, but powerful. There are photos, newspaper clippings, and a glass case holding fragments of rusted metal from the tank. A video plays, showing interviews with descendants of victims and survivors, connecting past to present in a way that's both heartbreaking and hopeful. One line from a survivor's grandchild lingers in your mind: "We carry their stories like molasses on our skin, sticky, unavoidable, part of who we are." As you leave the museum, the sun sets behind the city skyline, casting a golden glow over the harbor. The waters are calm now, but the memory of the flood remains, a reminder that beneath the surface, history is always flowing, sometimes slow and heavy, sometimes fast and devastating. And just like molasses, some stories take time to settle, but once they do, they leave a mark that's impossible to wash away. The city is quieter now, night drawing its velvet curtain over the rooftops and narrow alleys. You find yourself wandering back toward the waterfront, where the shadow of the old molasses tank once loomed. The air carries a salty chill, mingled faintly with the memory of that sticky disaster that changed so much. You stop by a bench overlooking the harbor. The water glistens under the moonlight, calm and reflective. It's hard to imagine the chaos that erupted here just years ago. The crashing wave, the roaring crowd, the thick molasses swallowing everything in its path. But the stillness feels important, a kind of peace earned through hardship. You think about the people who lived through that day, workers, families, firefighters, and the city itself. How all of them were bound together in a moment of crisis, their lives forever changed by a flood that was as tragic as it was absurd. There's a strange poetry in it. Molasses, something so sweet and familiar, becoming a symbol of disaster. As you sit, you remember a local tradition that emerged after the flood. Every year on January 15th, Bostonians hold a small remembrance ceremony. Flowers are laid, candles lit, and stories retold. It's not a grand event, but it's deeply meaningful. A quiet nod to those lost, a collective breath taken before the city moves on. You pull your coat tighter, watching the lights twinkle on the water. There's a sense that this place, this event, has seeped into the soul of Boston. Not just as a historical footnote, but as a lasting reminder of the fragility of human plans and the resilience of a community. Curious, you look around and spot a small group gathered nearby, some locals, some visitors. They're sharing memories and reading from old newspapers, their voices soft but clear. One man recites a poem written by a survivor's daughter, words filled with sorrow and hope, reminding everyone that from tragedy can come strength. Historians still wonder how the disaster would have unfolded in today's world of social media and instant news. Would the flood have spread fear faster? Would help have arrived sooner? Would the companies responsible face harsher consequences? It's a fascinating what if, but you decide some things are better left to speculation. Nearby, a couple of teenagers laugh quietly, daring each other to touch the iron railing, what's left of the barrier that once contained the tank. Their jokes are light, a little irreverent. It's a sign that while history shapes us, it doesn't have to weigh us down. You stand and stretch, the night air filling your lungs. This city, with all its quirks and scars, continues to live and breathe. The Molasses flood is part of its heartbeat, slow, sticky, and unforgettable. You take one last look at the harbor, the waves lapping gently against the shore. The past is never far away, but neither is the future. And with that thought, you start your walk home, ready to carry this strange, sweet story with you, sticky as molasses, but just as enduring. You wake the next morning to the distant sound of a city that never really sleeps. The streets hum with life, cars, and people weaving through the same neighborhoods where the Molasses flood once made such an unforgettable mark. Today, you decide to explore the science behind that sticky wave, the physics that made molasses behave less like syrup and more like a force of nature. You start by picturing the flood in your mind's eye, a towering tank filled with more than 2 million gallons of molasses, suddenly rupturing and releasing its contents in a wave racing through narrow streets at an estimated 35 miles per hour. It's a liquid, yes, but one far denser and slower than water. And yet, it moved fast enough to destroy buildings, drown horses, and trap people in its viscous grip. You lean into the strange contradiction. Molasses is thick, sticky, slow, except when it isn't. Scientists call this kind of behavior non-Newtonian fluid dynamics. It means that molasses can flow like a slow-moving river but also slam like a heavy wave under certain conditions. The cold temperature on that January day only made things worse, thickening the molasses to the point where it acted almost like a gelatinous wall barreling down the streets. As you walk, you imagine the wave's shape, thick, dark, and relentless. Unlike water, which splashes and sprays, molasses clings and coats everything it touches. That's why people described feeling trapped, like the syrup was wrapping around them, holding tight. You stop in front of a science museum that has a small interactive exhibit on fluid dynamics. Kids press buttons to see how liquids behave under different pressures and temperatures, and you watch a slow-motion video of honey dripping and syrup pouring. It's oddly hypnotic. You remember a zany fact. In the 1970s, NASA studied molasses-like fluids to understand how materials flow in space, because if molasses can behave this strangely on Earth, imagine zero gravity. You smile at the idea, astronauts floating around with sticky syrup. Definitely a scene for a sci-fi comedy. Outside, a street artist sketches a mural of the molasses flood, a wave made of thick, amber ribbons swirling around the city's landmarks. It's vivid, almost alive. You notice the artist included a tiny detail, a horse mid-leap, a nod to the animals caught in the disaster. It's a reminder that science and art often intersect in unexpected ways. The flood wasn't just a disaster, it was a phenomenon that forced people to rethink how substances move and how cities handle industrial risks. Historians can't agree on everything about the flood's physics, but everyone agrees it was a brutal lesson in how even the sweetest substances can become dangerous when left unchecked. You sip a coffee from a nearby cafe, tasting the bittersweet irony. Molasses might be a staple in baking, but on that January day, it was anything but sweet. As you prepare to move on, you glance back at the mural one last time. The wave seems to ripple in the fading light, a reminder that science isn't just in textbooks. It's in the streets, in history, in the very flow of time. And sometimes, it's as sticky as molasses itself. The late afternoon sun slants golden across the cobblestones as you find yourself drawn to the human side of the disaster, the stories of ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. You imagine yourself stepping into the shoes of a Boston resident in January 1919, trudging through the icy streets with the scent of coal smoke in your nose, when suddenly, without warning, the ground shakes and a monstrous wave of molasses barrels down on you. Some survivors describe the flood as a suffocating, engulfing force, a sticky trap that clung to skin and clothes like a living thing. You picture the chaos, the screams, the crashing timbers, the desperate scramble to higher ground or any foothold that could offer escape. Many people were trapped under debris, coated in molasses that thickened quickly in the cold, making it almost impossible to move. One survivor, a young woman, later recalled that the flood was like trying to swim in warm treacle. You shudder a bit at the thought, because you know that treacle is the British word for molasses, and swimming in it sounds about as fun as trying to run through a pool of peanut butter. Emergency responders, firefighters, police officers, and volunteers arrived quickly, though they faced unimaginable challenges. The thick molasses slowed them down, coated their equipment, and made every rescue attempt feel like wading through a sticky nightmare. One firefighter described the scene as walking through a swamp of syrup. Local hospitals overflowed with the injured, many suffering broken bones, burns from the cold molasses, or respiratory problems from inhaling the sticky fumes. Medical teams worked around the clock, but the disaster's sheer scale overwhelmed them. The city's press captured these human moments, publishing stories that combined heroism, heartbreak, and the absurdity of the situation. Headlines like "Molasses Horror Shocks Boston" and "Sticky Flood Wreaks Havoc" sold newspapers, but beneath the sensationalism were real lives changed forever. You pause to reflect on a less obvious impact, the psychological scars carried by survivors. For many, the flood wasn't just a physical ordeal, it was a trauma that haunted their dreams, a nightmare replayed every time they smelled molasses or heard the city's winter wind. Historians still debate how much the flood shaped Boston's community spirit. Some argue it brought people closer, forging bonds through shared grief and recovery. Others note the social tensions it exposed, especially the unequal risks faced by immigrant workers who lived near the tank. A quirky fact you can't resist sharing: some survivors reportedly used molasses as an improvised remedy for skin wounds, believing its stickiness helped seal cuts. It probably didn't help, but desperate times call for desperate and sticky measures. As evening deepens, you imagine the community gatherings that followed: church meetings, charity drives, and memorial services. Boston wasn't just rebuilding structures, it was rebuilding trust and hope. You leave the neighborhood feeling a profound connection to those who lived through the flood, a reminder that history isn't just dates and disasters. It's people, stories, and the messy, sweet threads that bind us across time. The city grows quieter now, night wrapping around the streets like a soft blanket. You find yourself drawn to the courtroom, where the flood's legal aftermath unfolded like a slow, sticky drama worthy of its own soap opera. You step into the world of lawsuits and accountability, a tangled web of blame that stretched over years. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company, owners of the tank, faced a barrage of claims. Families sought justice for lost loved ones, workers demanded compensation, and the city wanted answers. You picture the courtroom packed with lawyers and reporters, tension thick as molasses itself. Witnesses testified about shoddy construction, poor maintenance, and ignored warnings, details that slowly painted a picture of negligence rather than accident. One engineer who inspected the tank before the disaster admitted that the steel was too thin and the rivets improperly sealed. The company's defense argued that the flood was caused by sabotage or natural forces, trying to dodge responsibility. Historians still debate whether the company's behavior was gross negligence or just careless incompetence, but the jury saw through the smoke and mirrors. After months of legal battles, the company agreed to pay more than $1 million in damages, a hefty sum at the time. It was one of the first major industrial accident settlements in the United States, setting a precedent for corporate responsibility and victim compensation. You imagine how this outcome rippled through the business world, signaling to industries everywhere that cutting corners could come with a price. It was a shift from a Wild West mentality toward one of oversight and accountability. A quirky tidbit: some lawyers working the case reportedly joked that they were swept away by the flood of paperwork, literally drowning in molasses-themed puns. It sounds like a strange way to find humor in tragedy, but humor is often how people cope. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered to hear the verdict, their faces a mix of relief and sorrow. For the families, it wasn't just about money, it was about acknowledgement, about being heard. You pause, reflecting on how disasters often expose the flaws in our systems, pushing society to evolve. The Great Molasses Flood was no exception. As you walk away, the echo of courtroom debates lingers in your mind, a reminder that justice, like molasses, can be slow but sticky enough to hold powerful people accountable. The night air feels cooler now, the city's heartbeat steady. You're reminded that history is messy, complex, and sometimes unexpectedly sweet. The dawn breaks soft and quiet over Boston, washing the streets in pale light that gently chases away the long shadows of history. You wander toward the last place connected to the Great Molasses Flood, the spot where the towering tank once stood, now a simple empty lot framed by modern buildings and busy roads. It's strange to stand here, imagining a massive wave of sticky syrup rushing through these streets, yet all that remains is silence and the occasional hum of passing cars. The city has moved on, rebuilt, and transformed, but the memory lingers like a faint, sweet scent carried on the breeze. You think about the stories you've gathered, the science, the people, the aftermath, all threads in a strange tapestry woven from a disaster that feels both surreal and deeply human. You recall the workers who lost their lives, the families who struggled to heal, the engineers who learned hard lessons, and the city that refused to be defined by tragedy. There's a soft power in that refusal, a quiet resilience, like molasses slowly settling after a storm. The flood reminds us that sometimes progress comes at a cost, and that even the most unlikely events can ripple through time, shaping how we live and care for one another. You notice a small plaque planted in the ground, dedicated to those who perished and those who helped rebuild. It's simple, understated, a quiet tribute amid the bustling city. You kneel for a moment, honoring the lives and stories that history almost forgot. As you rise, the morning sun warms your face, and you feel a sense of calm. The city breathes around you, alive with the echoes of past and future. The Molasses flood may have been a sticky, chaotic moment, but it left behind something more enduring, a reminder that even in disaster, there is hope, and in history, there is connection. You take a deep breath, the sweet scent of possibility in the air. And with that, you step forward, ready to carry this strange, sweet story with you wherever you go. Now, turn off the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's time-traveling adventure together. The city settles into a gentle rhythm, the echoes of the past fading softly like the last notes of a lullaby. Imagine the streets of Boston, quiet now, bathed in moonlight, where history whispers through the bricks and pavement. The Molasses flood, with all its chaos and sorrow, is now a part of that calm, an enduring story that reminds us of our shared humanity. As you drift toward sleep, picture the slow flow of molasses, thick and steady, settling into place. Let its weight soothe you, reminding you that even the heaviest burdens can soften with time. The sweetness beneath the tragedy is a quiet promise that resilience and hope can emerge from the stickiest situations. You step away from the site of the Molasses flood, still tasting the echoes of tragedy, community, and quiet resilience. But Boston in 1919 wasn't just a backdrop for a syrupy disaster, it was a living, breathing city undergoing transformation. And now that you've wandered so deep into its streets and its stories, you might as well linger a little longer. Because beyond the molasses, there's more to discover. So much more. Let's stay a while and slip deeper into the rhythms of Boston in the year 1919, where trolley bells clang, factories hum, and the world is changing faster than a Model T down Beacon Street. You turn the corner and step into the heartbeat of a city at the edge of modernity. The first thing that hits you is the sound. The streets of 1919 Boston are loud, not with sirens or smartphones, but with the clatter of hooves on cobblestones, the rattle of electric trolleys, and the constant murmur of a city waking up. You pass newspaper boys shouting headlines, "Wilson back from Versailles," and "Women push for vote." Their caps are too big for their heads and their cheeks flushed from the cold. You buy a paper for a nickel and glance at the date, March 14th, 1919. Spring is coming, and the air carries the hopeful, slightly grimy scent of thawing snow and coal smoke. Boston is a patchwork of cultures and languages. You walk through the North End, where Italian immigrants bake fresh bread and hang laundry out the windows, and then down toward South Boston, where Irish families cram into tight row houses, sharing stories and steaming bowls of stew. The city is crowded. Nearly 800,000 people call it home, and it feels like most of them are outside today, bustling about in layers of wool and tweed. There's no air conditioning, no smartphones, and definitely no oat milk lattes. But what people lack in tech, they make up for in grit. You pass a group of women huddled outside a textile mill, discussing wages and working hours. The war may be over, but the battle for equality is heating up. The women's suffrage movement is gathering steam, and Boston is one of its louder voices. Historians agree that the push for the vote in 1919 was electric. Everywhere, signs and pamphlets demand attention, votes for women. The tension is palpable, but so is the excitement. Change is coming, whether the old guard likes it or not. And speaking of old guards, you spot a group of men in bowlers and stiff collars gathering near City Hall. They're debating the League of Nations and whether President Wilson is leading the country into another mess. One of them mutters something about European entanglements and spits into the gutter for emphasis. The First World War had ended just a few months earlier, in November of 1918, and the country is still catching its breath. Soldiers are coming home, some injured, some changed forever. Many return to find jobs gone or taken, families worn thin by years of rationing, and cities trying to remember how to be normal again. But what does normal even mean anymore? You duck into a barbershop just off Tremorne Street. The smell of pomade and pipe smoke fills the air. A man in the chair flips through a Sears Roebuck catalog, pointing out a new model of a Victrola phonograph he wants to save up for. His voice is muffled as the barber trims his mustache, but you catch a phrase that makes you smile. "I hear you can now order an entire house by mail." He's not wrong. Sears sells build-it-yourself homes, shipped right to your nearest train station. A home kit for just under $2,000, a little over $400 today, if you adjust for the times. It's DIY before Home Depot was a twinkle in anyone's eye. Back on the street, a boy runs past carrying a baseball glove. The Red Sox still rule the town, though, spoiler alert, they've just sold a certain Babe Ruth to the Yankees a few months ago, and Boston's baseball fans don't know it yet, but their glory days are taking a century-long nap. The city pulses with ambition and tension. Labor strikes are brewing. The Boston police strike will happen later this year, shaking the city to its boots. But for now, there's just enough calm before that storm. You notice a food vendor selling roasted chestnuts and chop suey from a wooden cart. Boston's Chinatown, though small, is growing, despite fierce discrimination and tight immigration laws. You learn from a nearby shopkeeper that many Chinese immigrants are confined to specific trades: laundry, food service, or tailoring. He shrugs and says, "It's not right, but that's the way it is." Historians still debate whether Boston's progressivism outweighed its prejudices in 1919. The city prides itself on learning and innovation. It is, after all, home to Harvard, MIT, and a dozen libraries older than most states. But old ideas die hard, especially ones tied to class and race. You continue your walk past Fenway Park, smaller and newer than the one you know. Opened just 7 years earlier, it's still considered a modern marvel, with its manual scoreboard and deep outfield. A group of schoolchildren march past you, led by a stern but kindly teacher. She's teaching them about the Spanish flu, which swept through the city just last year, killing thousands. The scars are still fresh. Everyone lost someone, it seems. You spot a sign in a shop window: "No spitting. Help prevent disease." Another relic of the flu pandemic that feels a little too familiar in today's world. You wonder how many people really followed the rule. A quirky fact floats to your mind: Boston was one of the first American cities to use public health posters to combat disease. They even had cartoon germs in top hats, warning kids to wash their hands and stay home when sick. Soap, the silent hero of the 20th century. As the afternoon stretches on, you end up in Copley Square, watching street performers entertain a small crowd. There's a violinist playing ragtime, a woman selling hand-sewn dolls, and a preacher shouting about the end times from atop a crate. His sermon ends with a strange prediction. And the seas will rise, and the earth will tremble, and syrup shall cover the wicked. You blink. Too soon, sir. Too soon. As dusk settles, the city glows with lamplight. Gaslights flicker to life, casting long shadows on brick walls and stone steps. You realize that for all its differences, 1919 Boston feels weirdly familiar. People grumble about taxes, worry about war, hope for better lives, and whisper about scandal. And somehow, amid it all, they go on. A city rebuilding from war. A people pressing forward through flu, flood, and fire. Immigrants carving out lives. Women fighting for their voices. Scientists tinkering in labs. Writers scribbling in cafes. Dreamers standing on rooftops staring out over a city that never stops growing. You stand still for a moment and let the sounds settle into a lull. A trolley bell rings in the distance. A dog barks. Someone hums a lullaby behind a nearby window. And you breathe in the very heartbeat of 1919. Boston, scrappy, scarred, and stubbornly sweet. The echoes of trolley wheels fade into silence, and the amber gaslights dim like fading stars above the cobbled streets. Let the weight of history settle gently around you now, like a warm wool blanket tugged just under your chin. Boston in 1919, with its accents, ambitions, and old stone sidewalks, grows quieter in your memory, like a photograph slipping into sepia. Feel the pace slow. The people tuck into bed behind brick facades. The paper bows are finally silent. The trolley rests in its depot. Even the stubborn molasses in your mind has stopped its crawl and rests now in sweet, still pools. You're safe here. Time has done its work. The past has offered its story, and you've learned so much on this journey. That's what we do here. Travel back in time and expand our knowledge as we go. So close your eyes now. Let your breath grow deeper. Let the old city fade, its gaslights flickering out one by one. Sleep comes easy when history stands watch. Sweet dreams, time traveler. You've earned them.